The slap came so suddenly that even the musicians stopped playing. One moment, Lady Eliza Harcourt stood beneath the glittering chandeliers of Blackmere Palace, surrounded by hundreds of nobles dressed in silk, velvet, and jewels. The next, her father's hand struck her across the face, hard enough to turn her head. Every whisper in the ballroom died. For years, Lord Harcourt had controlled his daughter with shame, threats, and the constant reminder that she had never been the child he wanted. But that night, Eliza had finally refused to obey him, and in front of the very society that had spent months calling her an embarrassment, her father punished her for it. Across the ballroom, Duke Adrian Ravensworth went completely still. Only moments earlier, he had been speaking with several noblemen. Now his attention was fixed entirely on his wife. Eliza lifted her head slowly, one hand against her burning cheek. Her father moved toward her again. Adrian was already crossing the room. Guests stepped aside as the Duke approached, his expression colder with every stride. Then his hand closed around the hilt of the sword at his side. That was when everyone understood that the scandal was no longer about a father humiliating his daughter. It was about what the Duke intended to do next. And perhaps the most astonishing part was that 3 months earlier, Adrian Ravensworth had barely wanted Eliza as his wife. Their marriage had begun without love and almost without trust. Society called her the Duke's unfortunate bride, the disgrace of the Harcourt family, the scheming woman who had somehow trapped one of the kingdom's most powerful men into marriage. Adrian himself had seemed to believe some of it. He slept in another wing of Blackmere. Their conversations rarely extended beyond formal dinners. At every gathering, Eliza endured women whispering behind jeweled fans while men watched her with knowing smiles. But none of them knew how the marriage had truly happened, not even Adrian. And before that winter night was over, he would discover that the woman everyone believed had trapped him had actually been trapped first. 3 months earlier, Eliza Harcourt had still been living beneath her father's roof, where obedience mattered far more than happiness. Lord Percival Harcourt had never hidden which of his daughters he preferred. Catherine, the elder, was beautiful, polished, and perfectly suited to the world he valued. She knew how to charm a crowded drawing room, how to flatter the right people, and, most importantly, how to obey without question. Eliza had never learned that particular skill. She preferred books to balls, and honest conversation to carefully practiced smiles. She remembered the names of servants other nobles barely noticed, questioned decisions she thought cruel, and had an unfortunate habit of speaking when her father expected silence. Percival called it stubbornness. Eliza had begun to recognize it as the small piece of herself he had never managed to control. By that winter, the Harcourt estate was drowning beneath debts Percival could no longer hide. His solution was simple. Catherine would marry Duke Adrian Ravensworth, and the Harcourt name would be rescued by one of the greatest fortunes in the kingdom. There was only one problem. Adrian refused. He had no intention of becoming the wealthy answer to another nobleman's financial ruin. Then Eliza discovered something far worse than debt. While searching through old household accounts, she found records showing that Percival had secretly taken money left to her by her late mother and used it to keep his failing estate alive. When she confronted him, he did not deny it. Instead, he warned her that exposing him would destroy Catherine's prospects, disgrace their family, and leave everyone they depended upon facing ruin. Then came the threat Eliza had feared most. Percival intended to marry her to one of his creditors. Desperate, Eliza sought Adrian privately, believing his influence might be enough to stop the arrangement. Their meeting lasted only minutes. It was long enough. Someone saw them together. By morning, whispers had become scandal. Percival moved quickly, telling anyone who would listen that Eliza had deliberately placed herself alone with the Duke, so he would be forced to marry her. Adrian faced an ugly choice: walk away and leave Eliza's reputation destroyed, or marry a woman he suspected had helped engineer the entire trap. He chose marriage, and on their wedding night, with Blackmere silent around them, Adrian made the terms painfully clear. Eliza would have his name, his protection, and every comfort owed to a duchess. But his heart was the one thing she should never expect. Blackmere was everything Eliza expected a duke's estate to be: vast, beautiful, intimidating, and filled with people who already seemed to know what they thought of her. What she had not expected was Adrian's restraint. He never insulted her. He never raised his voice or treated her with deliberate cruelty. In some ways, that would have been easier to endure. Instead, he was impeccably polite, speaking to her with the same distant courtesy he might have offered a visiting ambassador. So Eliza made a decision. She would not spend her marriage begging a man to believe in her. If Blackmere was to be her home, she would find a place in it on her own terms. Adrian began noticing the changes almost immediately. When an elderly maid stumbled and shattered an expensive silver tray, Eliza's first concern was whether the woman had cut herself. When tenants arrived after a poor harvest, Eliza sat with their account books long enough to discover that several families were being charged unfair fees by an estate agent. The money Adrian had assigned for new gowns quietly went instead toward repairing leaking roofs in 2 tenant cottages. None of it matched the ambitious woman he had expected. Then one evening, Adrian found her inside the stable, beside a young groom who had been kicked by a frightened horse. Eliza was kneeling in the straw, holding a clean cloth against the boy's bleeding arm, while they waited for the physician. Adrian watched her for a moment, before asking why the Duchess of Blackmere was doing work any servant could have done. Eliza looked up at him. Pain does not become smaller because the person suffering has no title. Adrian said nothing, but he remembered it. After that, their dinners changed almost without either of them acknowledging it. Conversations that once lasted minutes began stretching longer. Adrian occasionally found himself waiting until Eliza entered before touching his meal. One evening, she made an unexpectedly sharp remark about one of his pompous acquaintances. Adrian laughed. Eliza stared at him in surprise. He immediately became serious again, and she looked down to hide her own smile. Then, during a morning ride, Eliza's horse suddenly reared at the sound of a gunshot from a distant field. She slipped from the saddle. Adrian reached her before she hit the ground. For several breathless seconds, she remained against his chest, his arm firmly around her waist. Neither spoke. Then Adrian released her too quickly. Whatever was growing between them frightened him, because one question still remained unanswered. Had she truly trapped him into marriage? Before either could confront it, the sound of carriage wheels echoed along Blackmere's drive. Eliza turned. The Harcourt crest gleamed on the approaching carriage door. The warmth vanished from her face. Her father had come to Blackmere. Lord Harcourt entered Blackmere as though he had been invited by affection rather than necessity. Before Adrian, he was charming, gracious, almost fatherly. He praised the estate, complimented Eliza's position as Duchess, and spoke warmly of how pleased he was to see his daughter so well settled. Eliza knew better. The moment he found her alone, The smile disappeared. He told her the Harcourt debts had worsened. Creditors were becoming impatient, and one substantial payment would be enough to silence them. Adrian could provide it without difficulty. All Eliza had to do was ask. She refused. Percival reminded her that without his intervention, she would never have become Duchess of Blackmere. Eliza answered that becoming a duchess had never given him the right to use her as a doorway into Adrian's fortune. Her father's expression hardened. Then he mentioned Catherine. If the Harcourt name collapsed, Catherine's prospects would collapse with it. No respectable family would welcome the daughter of a disgraced debtor. For years, that threat might have worked. This time, Eliza still refused. Percival left her with a warning, but he had already prepared another weapon. Later that evening, he requested a private conversation with Adrian and placed a folded letter before him. According to Percival, it had been discovered among Eliza's belongings shortly before the wedding. The letter appeared to be written in Eliza's hand. Its words were devastating. It described how she intended to arrange a private meeting with Adrian, ensure they were seen together, and leave him with no honorable choice except marriage. Adrian read it twice. For weeks, he had been fighting against his first judgment of Eliza. Everything he had seen at Blackmere had suggested that she was kinder, stronger, and far less calculating than he had believed. Now the letter seemed to prove he had been a fool for trusting her. That night at dinner, the fragile warmth between them vanished. Adrian barely looked at her. His answers became short, formal, cold. Eliza endured it until she could no longer pretend not to notice. Later, she found him alone and asked what she had done. Adrian silently handed her the letter. Eliza read the first few lines and went pale. "I never wrote this." Adrian wanted to believe her. That was what frightened him most, because the handwriting looked almost exactly like hers. Eliza read it again, and understanding settled over her with a sickening clarity. Her father had not merely taken advantage of the scandal. He had created evidence to make Adrian believe she had planned it. Before Eliza could discover how, Percival cheerfully announced that he and Catherine would remain at Blackmere until after Adrian's approaching winter ball. Eliza watched her father smiling among the guests and finally understood the danger. Percival was no longer simply trying to control her. He was making certain that the one person Eliza had begun to care about would never completely trust her, and she still did not know why. By the night of Blackmere's winter ball, the entire estate seemed to glow. Carriages crowded the drive. Candlelight spilled from every window. Music swept through the galleries, and hundreds of nobles filled the ballroom beneath chandeliers bright enough to turn midnight into gold. But beneath the elegance, another kind of entertainment had already begun. The whispers about Eliza had returned. Lord Harcourt had made certain of it. He never openly accused his daughter of trapping the Duke. He did not need to. A carefully chosen remark here, a regretful sigh there, and soon the forged letter had become the most delicious scandal of the evening. Women watched Eliza over the edges of their fans. Men spoke her name with amused smiles. By the time she crossed the ballroom, the story had already changed from rumor into accepted truth. She had pursued Adrian. She had arranged the compromising meeting. She had forced one of the kingdom's most powerful men into marriage. Near the refreshment table, Eliza heard a woman laugh softly and call her Blackmere's shameful little bride. She stopped, only for a second. Across the room, Adrian heard it too. His expression hardened, and he began moving toward her, but Eliza did not wait to be rescued. She lifted her chin and walked away before anyone could see how deeply the words had cut. She would not give them her tears. While Eliza disappeared into the crowd, Adrian's doubts finally began to crack. Catherine, unaware of the importance of what she was saying, mentioned that her father had known exactly where Eliza intended to meet Adrian on the night of the scandal. Adrian went still. Eliza had told him the meeting had been private, so how had Percival known? The answer came moments later, when an elderly servant who had accompanied the Harcourts quietly approached him. Trembling, the man admitted that Percival had ordered someone to follow Eliza that evening. The witness who supposedly stumbled upon Eliza and Adrian together had not stumbled upon anything. He had been sent there. Suddenly, everything became clear. The scandal had been arranged. Eliza had never trapped Adrian. She had been trapped beside him. Adrian immediately searched the ballroom for her. But Percival had already found her. He cornered Eliza near the center of the room and demanded that she persuade Adrian to pay his debts before the night ended. Eliza refused. Percival threatened Catherine again. Still, she refused. For the first time in her life, Eliza looked directly at the man who had taught her to fear him. "You have spent my entire life teaching me to fear disappointing you. I am finished being afraid." Nearby conversations began to stop. Percival realized people were watching. His face reddened. He called her selfish, worthless, a disgrace who had nearly destroyed her own family. Eliza did not lower her eyes. "Then perhaps I was never the shame of this family." Something in Percival snapped. His hand rose, and across the ballroom, Adrian saw it. The slap echoed across the ballroom. Eliza staggered, one hand flying to her cheek. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Then Adrian's voice cut through the silence. "You struck my wife." He did not shout. He did not need to. The calmness in his voice was more dangerous than anger. Percival turned slowly. Adrian was already walking toward them. For months, he had been careful, restrained, almost impossible to read. Now, there was nothing distant in his expression. Every step carried the weight of a man who had finally understood exactly what had been done to the woman beside him. He stopped between Eliza and her father. Percival recovered quickly enough to protest. Eliza was his daughter, he insisted. Whatever happened between them was a family matter. He had every right to correct her when she behaved disgracefully. Adrian's jaw tightened. She stopped being yours to command, long before she became mine to protect. A murmur swept through the room. Percival's humiliation turned to fury. He reached toward Eliza again, perhaps intending to pull her away, perhaps only to remind her who had controlled her for most of her life. He never reached her. Steel flashed beneath the chandeliers. Adrian drew his sword. Gasps broke through the ballroom as the blade came between father and daughter, not pointed at Percival's throat, not raised to strike, simply held there as an unmistakable boundary. Adrian warned him that he would not take another step toward the Duchess of Blackmere. Then he turned toward the watching guests. The truth, he said, was considerably uglier than the rumors they had enjoyed spreading. Eliza had never arranged their compromising meeting. Percival had known where she would be. He had ordered someone to follow her. The witness who supposedly discovered them had been placed there deliberately, and the letter claiming Eliza had planned everything was a forgery. The whispers vanished. Faces that had watched Eliza with contempt only moments earlier now turned toward Lord Harcourt. Adrian looked at them all. Anyone who had called Eliza calculating, disgraceful, or shameful had mocked a woman who had been deceived by her own father and then blamed for surviving it. And from that night forward, no one would insult the Duchess of Blackmere and expect the Duke to remain silent. Eliza stared at Adrian. For the first time since their marriage, someone had stood between her and her father, instead of asking her to endure him, but the ache inside her did not disappear. When the room finally began breathing again, she looked at Adrian and asked the one question that mattered more than the sword in his hand. Do you defend me because I am your Duchess, or because I finally matter to you? Adrian's expression changed, and for once, the Duke of Blackmere had no answer ready. Percival Harcourt left Blackmere that night without the authority he had carried through its doors. Adrian ordered that he be escorted from the estate, and before morning, the evidence of his financial deception had been placed in the hands of solicitors. The debts he had hidden, the money taken from Eliza's inheritance, and the arrangements he had made using his daughters as bargaining pieces would finally have to be answered for. For Catherine, the truth was almost as painful. She had spent years believing that obedience had earned their father's love, only to discover that Percival had been planning to use her marriage exactly as he had tried to use Eliza's. Her future had never been sacred to him. It had simply been another asset he intended to trade when the price was right. Only then did Catherine begin to understand how much Eliza had quietly tried to protect her from. But Eliza was not thinking about her father when she finally returned to her rooms. She was thinking about Adrian. He found her there some time later, after the music had stopped and the last guests had departed. For once, the Duke did not hide behind formality. He admitted that his greatest mistake had not been marrying her. It had been deciding who she was before ever allowing her the chance to show him. He had listened to gossip. He had trusted suspicion. And even when her kindness contradicted everything he believed, part of him had continued waiting for proof that she would betray him. Eliza did not make forgiveness easy. She reminded him that drawing a sword for her tonight could not erase the months when she had lived beneath his roof, feeling as though she were guilty of something she had never done. Adrian did not argue. He told her she had every right to be angry. Then he gave her something her father never had: a choice. If she wished to leave Blackmere, he would not stop her. Her inheritance would be restored. She would have a home of her own, financial independence, and every protection his name could provide. She owed him nothing. And strangely, that meant more to Eliza than the sword. Percival had always called control a form of love. Adrian was finally proving that love could mean setting someone free. Then, quietly, he told her the rest. He had first respected her kindness, then he had admired her courage. Somewhere along the way, he had begun listening for her footsteps at dinner and searching crowded rooms for her face. Without realizing when it happened, Adrian had fallen in love with the wife he had never wanted. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Why tell me now?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because tonight, I realized I was more afraid of losing you than I had ever been of loving you." Eliza was not ready to erase everything that had happened, but slowly she reached for his hand, and when Adrian closed his fingers around hers, neither of them needed anything more. Several months later, Blackmere no longer felt like the place Eliza had entered as a frightened bride. The estate had changed, but so had she. She no longer lowered her eyes when powerful men questioned her decisions, nor did she shrink beneath the judgment of women who once whispered about her behind jeweled fans. She began overseeing repairs to tenant cottages, organizing support for struggling families, and using her position in ways that made the title of Duchess feel like something she had earned rather than something forced upon her. Adrian changed too. The distance between them disappeared. He no longer pretended not to wait for her at dinner, and when they attended formal gatherings, his affection was no longer hidden behind careful politeness. At one such gathering, Eliza found herself face to face with the same noblewoman who had once called her Blackmere's shameful little bride. The woman approached nervously, clearly expecting anger. Eliza simply smiled. Then she walked past her. Months earlier, those words would have wounded her. Now they meant nothing. She had finally stopped measuring her worth by the approval of people who had never cared enough to know her. Even Catherine began returning to Blackmere, this time without their father. Their relationship did not heal overnight, but for the first time, the sisters were learning how to speak to one another without Percival standing between them. One evening, Eliza noticed Adrian's ceremonial sword hanging above the fireplace. She glanced at him with amusement and reminded him that he had nearly created a scandal by drawing it in the middle of his own ballroom. Adrian smiled and told her he would endure 1,000 scandals before allowing anyone to make her believe she was worthless again. Eliza looked at him for a moment. "Good, because I have no intention of leaving." Adrian crossed the room and kissed her. Eliza had entered Blackmere believing she was the Duke's unwanted, shameful bride. Instead, she discovered that the shame had never belonged to her, and the husband who once promised her everything except his heart eventually gave her the one thing her own family never had: a love that did not require her to be afraid. If you enjoy stories of courageous women, protective dukes, and love that arrives when least expected, subscribe for more stories.